There are very few people, Mike Doherty, who have the history that you do with St. Mary's University when it comes to sports and athletics. Perhaps you could take us back to your family history and their involvement with St. Mary's.
Well, my father went to St. Mary's High School in the late 1920s. He got into some trouble at Oxford Street School, and so his father sent him to St. Mary's because the Irish Christian Brothers were originally formed to deal with kids who were tough to deal with. Not that my father was so bad, but he really got into sports at St. Mary's, loved rugby, loved hockey, loved the Irish Christian Brothers. They were kind of rough and ready, and he was too. And that appealed to him, I guess. And he had about 3 or 4 good years at St. Mary's and playing sports. And he never forgot that, and he always talked about it and about the friends he made playing sports. And he was always interested in watching, or not, he used to go and see St. Mary's participate in sports. And he followed how they were doing, especially in hockey and football. And then around 1956, my brother went to St. Mary's High School in grade 9. And St. Mary's High School at that time was located on Roby Street. My father had gone to the school on Windsor Street. And my brother loved sports too. He played sports, and when he was in grade 10, he became the gear manager for the football team for Father Elmer McGilvery, who was a very popular ex-hockey star and baseball star too. And he was a teacher at St. Mary's High School, and at that time he was coaching the college football team, the college hockey team, and the high school hockey team. And my brother continued to be the manager of the football team until 1963, while he was attending St. Mary's. And he often talked about the football team, or who was coming to play on the hockey team, and what was going on, and how the team was progressing. And I went to all the games, naturally, with a lot of the other kids. I took I guess St. Mary's was sort of in my DNA between my father and my brother, so all my life I've followed St. Mary's, you know.
When the campus was at Windsor, the facilities for athletics and sports weren't available. So how did they compete? Where did they compete?
Well, they did have some facilities. They had a hockey rink they called the Roarum, which was about probably half the size of the St. Mary's rink that we had before. It was just a little rink, but it was functional, and they played a lot of hockey there. And but they would have played games at the Halifax Forum at the Shirley Street Arena. And they had a huge rugby or football field later where St. Pat's High School was. All that property that is open space now on the corner of Quintal Road and Windsor Street, that was a playground for the St. Mary's students. And they had handball courts there and tennis courts. And they had basketball teams, track and field teams. They played all sports and competed with other schools from the city and from all over the province. They were very much into sports there, and they had a pretty good record as in sporting events. And they years ago, going back to like maybe the 19-teens and early 20s, there was a city hockey league with and St. Mary's, Dalhousie, and Kings would have participated in it. St. Mary's would have often won the city championship. So the sports was always very important at St. Mary's. They always supported the teachers there, and the people who ran the university always supported sports. And that carried over to a fair extent here in the first year at St. Mary's on Roby Street. Father O'Donnell was the athletic director. He wasn't a full-time athletic director, but he was the athletic director. And one of the first announcements he made was that they were going to try to provide a good sports program here. It would be good for school spirit.
The Christian Brothers were very strong advocates for sports and athletics. When the school moved from Windsor to here, in Roby, did that continue? Was there an emphasis placed
very much
on
so.
Academic and athletic?
I would say both. The Jesuits did just about everything they could to encourage the kids to play sports. In the high school, there were about 100 kids going to the high school. Most of them played sports. they had good intramural programs for them. And step by step, they provided just about everything they could for the university students. When they first moved into the university was not really complete. There was a gymnasium on the horizon, and they would have been building that throughout the 1950s. At one point, around 1957 or 56 or 57, it looked like they might have to sort of curtail it a little bit because they were short of funds. And somebody came up with about $25,000 to help them, and they finished it, and it was a beautiful gymnasium, state of the art. You know, in 1958, it was with a beautiful floor and the fiberglass backboards. There was no other gymnasium like it. And that spurred, the students really used it a lot. And then and the basketball team had been competitive leading up until that time. And then when Frank Baldwin brought a couple of Americans up to play on the team, and they became really competitive with St. FX and Acadia and Dalhousie, the students really got behind them. And the gymnasium, you would have been in there, I'm sure, during some games it seemed like the roof would come off. The intensity of the games and the fans was quite amazing sometimes.
But when they moved from Windsor to Roby,
Yeah.
the first athletes to represent the school as Huskies weren't football players, weren't basketball players or hockey players.
Yeah.
They were tennis players.
Yeah, 3 tennis players. Nolan, Scriven, and I should know, I forget the last guy's name, but they went up to New Brunswick to play in the tennis tournament. You were supposed to have 6 players to make a team. St. Mary's only had 3, but they won the championship. And when they arrived back at St. Mary's, they got a royal welcome down at the either the bus station or the train station. A couple hundred students were down there with trumpets and drums, and it was like they had won the world championship. But it was the first time St. Mary's had won anything in a few years. And so that started the ball rolling. And then Father Rourke and Ken Fultz and Ken Flynn all got together. Father Rourke was big on football, big on Canadian football.
Now prior to this, they played rugby.
Yeah, but when Father Rourke was at the St. Mary's on Windsor Street, he was trying to get the ball rolling for Canadian football. And he did a lot of work to encourage it and to organize it. And among other things, he was, I think, even the public address announcer at the football games. But he went to the meetings, with other people who were organizing Canadian football at the time. And he was really a big force in getting it all started. And then they started off, when they got here, they had some old football gear. I think Notre Dame might have sent it up to them. But they needed new football gear, and they invested about $400 and bought a lot of things to help so they could have a good interfac league. They started out by having an interfaculty league with 4 teams. And within a couple of years, they had a team to represent the university. And it was made up of about 70% students and 30% civilians, guys who had played high school, they wanted to keep on playing. And St. FX had a good junior football team, and they also had a senior football team in the Nova Scotia Senior League. And the 4th team, St. Mary's, Shearwater, St. FX, yeah, and the Cape Breton, HMCS Cape Breton. And they had a very competitive junior football league for about 6 years. And that's where St. Mary's sort of cut their teeth in football.
How did Bob Hayes wind up at St. Mary's as an assistant junior coach?
Well, Bob Hayes was the football hero around here with the Shearwater Flyers. Mind you, Shearwater had other great players too. He wasn't a one-man team, but he was maybe the most sensational player on the team. Bruce Walker was another one who was a terrific football player, and others. They were all good football players on Shearwater. But Poe's father, the main thing that probably got Father McGilvery to invite him over to help with the coaching was because he was teaching full-time in the high school. He was coaching the college team, the high school team, and the high school hockey team, and the college hockey team. And he was also engaged in his own studies in becoming a Jesuit. So he was a busy guy. So he probably thought, well, first of all, I need some help. And Bob Hayes came over here and helped him, and to get ready, I suppose, to play Notre Dame de Grâce. And then during some other time in that year, Father McGilvery was attending a meeting that was centered around business from the Nova Scotia Junior Football League, and he happened to end up sitting beside Bob Hayes, and he got an idea. He thought, geez, I wonder if this guy would be interested in coming to coach at St. Mary's. And so he asked him if he would, just sort of out of the blue. And Bob Hayes immediately expressed enthusiasm for it. And Hayes, I believe, I remember he said that later that, and he said, well, make me the athletic director. He thought he'd get a little bit more than just being the football coach. He'll be the athletic director. And he was really surprised when McGilvery went for it and thought, yeah, okay, we'll see if we can make you the athletic director. Hayes was only about 22 or maybe 24 years old, very young. And Father McGilvery said he practically ran back to St. Mary's after the meeting to tell Father O'Donnell, geez, I think we might get Bob Hayes to be the athletic director. And they thought that was a really sort of a coup for St. Mary's, because Hayes was, at that time, one of the most popular and favorite athletes around here. And he was considered he was the undefeated champion. The Shearwater Flyers said, when they won the Canadian Intermediate Championship in 1957, that was considered a big, big deal here, because there were lots of good intermediate teams in Canada. The guys on Shearwater, of course, would have been from all over Canada, but they were a real sort of a local team because people had been watching them for a few years. And they had about 6,000 people over at the Wanderers grounds to see them when they won the championship, so they were big. And to get Bob Hayes to be steering the ship for the St. Mary's Sports, that was considered to be, that's like I think Rocky Marciano to be the coach of the boxing team. That's the way it was looked at that time. And he came here with enthusiasm, and one of the things about Bob Hayes, he was a great innovator. It was never dull when Bob Hayes was around. He was always doing something that nobody else had done in football, it seemed. The double quarterback system, the new goal posts. He'd even be out there running back kickoffs against the football on occasion, daring them to tackle, bring them down. I've seen him do that. I only saw him do it once, but I did see him do it.
I saw him do it more than that.
Oh,
But one of the things was Don Loney was Bob Hayes' coach when he played for the Shearwater Flyers and won that national title.
Yeah.
When Hayes took over as athletic director and football coach, I think he stole or borrowed some of the things that Loney was doing at St. X.
Yeah.
One of those things that gave St. Mary's a huge boost was recruitment.
Yeah.
Up until then, there had been recruitment at St. Mary's, but I don't think the way Hayes did.
No. The odd guy would show up here from the New England Saints and play for St. Mary's. Yeah. Bobby Shea, Leo Rancourt. I can remember seeing some of those guys when I was 11 or 12 years old. But Bob Hayes and Frank Baldwin, and it might have been Father O'Donnell or Father Hennessy or Father Rourke. One of the priests went down with them. They drove down to New England and they went on a barnstorming expedition, I suppose you'd call it, and spoke to the students. And for the kids in New England, they could come, it was a status thing to get a degree from Jesuit University. It was in the States. And the fact that this was a Jesuit university would have helped them. And the cost of coming here and the tuition was much cheaper in Halifax than it would have been in the States. And so this was a good deal for not only for the athletes, but a lot of the other kids going to high school who heard about it. And by 1959, I was here in 1959 in grade 9, and there were all kinds of American guys here. And at least 1/3 of the football team was made up of Americans. And several of the basketball players were American. They brought up John Riley and another guy, Kelly, and John Kelly, and to play on the St. Mary's basketball team. And I think that was the first year that the gym was complete. And I can remember we heard about Riley. I talked to guys who were going to St. Mary's High School with my brother. They'd often come to the house and they'd be talking about all the stuff that was going on at St. Mary's in sports, mostly not academics. They all liked playing sports. And my brother took me down to the St. Mary's gym. I'd be about 12 years old, and it was the night we just watched the Grey Cup game. I think Hamilton beat Winnipeg, or Winnipeg beat Hamilton 35-28. You probably would have. It was a great Grey Cup game. Then we came down to watch St. Mary's play St. Dunstan's basketball, and John Riley was playing. And we had never seen anybody like John Riley. He was like Bob Cousy for St. Mary's. They had Billy Mullane, Brian Ross, Freddie Walker. They were good. They were very good players. But Riley, he'd grown up in New England playing in Boston, I think, and an outstanding player down there. And he just mesmerized the fans off, and they loved him, And they loved the other guys too, because they had seen them playing for St. Mary's before, and they all gelled together as a really good team. And I remember the first time they went down one Friday, I think it was on a Friday afternoon, they went down and played St. Evex. And St. Evex were the champions every year in basketball. And they had a gym that was not a very large gym, and it sort of favored the home team apparently quite a bit. But anyway, St. Mary's, they lost like 61-60. Riley got, I think, 25 points. And it was either, I'm not sure if it went into overtime or St. Evex won like in the last few seconds, but it showed everybody, wow, St. Mary's are really in it now. And the fan support was really strong. And high school kids would come down to watch from QEH and St. Pat's and St. Mary's. And as the season wore on, I could remember some of my relatives who never would have gone to see a basketball game. But after they went down, they came down to see St. Mary's play Acadia, St. Mary's play Dalhousie, St. Mary's play St. Evex. And the games were often sensational towards the end of the games. And it was exciting for everybody. And these people kept coming. And they'd come with their kids, really, high school sons, and they really enjoyed the basketball. They never looked back. The basketball never faltered after that.
When did the football program take the leap and become as competitive as basketball?
Well, probably the same year. That year, 59 was probably that was the greatest year up until then that St. Mary's ever had in sports on Robie Street or Windsor Street. And largely because, Hayes, Frank had been coaching the team since 51, and he had led QEH to the Canadian juvenile title early in the 1950s. And he had won a lot of championships with minor league teams, but never a championship with St. Mary's. But the basketball team was exciting, and then Hayes came up here. He went down to the States, and he came back with, one guy was Ted Chandonnet, and there was another guy by the name of Shap Delane, and they were running backs. He had Peter Young as the quarterback, and Peter Young was a good quarterback. I don't think he had Bobby Leahy yet, but he had about 8 or 9, Tim Moynihan, Frank Armand. He had 8 or 9 really good American players. The trip to the States really did pay dividends. And then, and so the football team was then in the intercollegiate league. There was an intercollegiate league with about 8 teams in it.
When did that happen?
That was, I would say, in 1959. I think the year after they lost to Notre Dame de Grasse in the Wanderers grounds, and they had been participating in the college league and the junior football league. The next year they were strictly intercollegiate. And it was a competitive league, and St. Mary's had a very good team that year, and they used to play over at the Wanderers grounds mostly, I think. It wasn't too long after that they played, they brought up Dick Loisel. And when people started talking about him and his background, and they see him practicing down here, nobody had ever seen anybody throw a football like Dick Loisel. He was really terrific. But one of the things that spurred St. Mary's on also was one night, it might have been in 1960 or 61, I'm not sure, but Hayes stuck his neck out, as he would. I mean, he was always willing to, go on to the next level. And they had an exhibition football game between Dalhousie and St. Mary's. And St. Mary's had a terrific running back in Greg McClear. He was a workhorse on the team. He and Chandonette, and there was a guy, Tibby Johnson was a wing back, and Ray Roy. These guys were all on the same team, and Peter Young was the quarterback. But it was a beautiful night over in the Wanderers grounds. They had about 2,500 to 3,000 people showed up to see Dalhousie play St. Mary's. They hadn't played for years in any kind of football, and Dalhousie had a pretty decent team. Teddy Wickwire and Peter Corkum and Stu McGinnis and Nicky Weatherston, Steve Thompson. These guys were all good football players, and Dalhousie were a very competitive team. For many years, Dalhousie was the place to go to see a football game. Great atmosphere over Studley Field. They had their band, the cheerleaders. They were always singing or chanting stuff. Full house every game. We'd go over there as kids. But anyway, so they matched St. Mary's up. Merv Shaw was the coach of Dalhousie, and they matched up against St. Mary's. And St. Mary's gave them a real good game. They lost. I think the score was 21-7. But in the game, Greg McClear, who was a great favorite at St. Mary's, really good guy and good student. Did you know Greg McClear at all? Big
Yes.
guy. Yeah, big guy. Strong. And on 2 occasions, he ran through the Dal line for touchdowns of like 60 and 65 yards. And I mean, they were legitimate touchdowns, except that, I mean, everybody was chasing them, trying to stop them, but they couldn't. But St. Mary's were offside on the both plays, so they were called back, which was very disappointing from a St. Mary's point of view. But it was a really good game. Both teams put on a good show that night. And so St. Mary's had really moved up a notch. They showed, they were on the move, and then Hayes continued to bring guys up, and I think the next year was when Loisel played his first game, and if my memory serves me correctly, over at the Wanderers grounds, and they played Dalhousie, and they beat Dalhousie by about 35 points that night. The St. Mary's were then sort of like a powerhouse that night, and a big crowd. I can remember I got flashbacks into the, that evening. I can remember them bringing Knucker Burns in a chariot. He was the number one sports fans and a big St. Mary's fan. And they brought him in on this, somebody was dragging him in with a chariot or some kind of a wagon. But big crowd, enthusiastic, under the lights. And then, of course, I think that might have been the first year in the Blue Nose Football League. I don't know if
Actually, the Blue Nose Conference came into being in 1965.
Oh, okay, it wasn't the Blue Nose League then, would have been collegiate.
By 1964,
Mm-hmm.
St. Mary's would win the Atlantic
Oh, I
Bowl
remember
title
that, yeah, okay.
for the first time ever. Would that have been another defining moment?
Oh, that would be huge. Well, there was another defining moment before that. But,
when they beat St. F.
Well, one of the most defining moments was when Paul Puma made the big run back against St. FX down in St. FX. I got ahead of myself there with that big win with Dick Loisel. But they did, when Loisel played his first game, I'm pretty sure, it was a very impressive start against Dalhousie. So then, I guess they played in the Intercollegiate League for a couple more years and would have been very competitive. But then when Hayes was coaching them, and They played that game down at St. FX in probably 1963. I was out of school that year. But Paul would have been here. And a few other guys came down from Ontario. They seem to have more guys from Ontario than Americans. They probably still had a few Americans, but they had some good players from Upper Canada. And when St. Mary's went down to play St. FX, I read in the paper. I mean, I didn't, and I would have seen it on television, but I wasn't at the game. But I think on the opening kickoff, Paul Puma ran the kickoff back to about the 5 or 10 yard line against St. FX. Nobody did that against St. FX.
But they didn't beat Santa Fe.
No, they lost by
that
a
year.
point, I think, like
The
11.
next
something.
year,
Yeah.
they ended the streak.